There's nothing more satisfying than finding the perfect green paint for your living room. Except maybe popping open that can of Valspar Ultra and rolling that first smooth stroke on the wall. And there's nothing more satisfying than admiring your freshly painted wall.
Ooh.
Except maybe peeling off the painter's tape to see those crisp edges. But the most satisfying part of all? Valspar Ultra's price tag, starting at $29.98 a gallon. Affordable, durable, available at Lowe's. Price varies by Shein.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. From the outside, from a privileged point of view, Henrietta Lacks' life was less than overly blessed. It was, to be brutally honest, too troubled, too poor, too painful, and too short. But it would change everything about how you and I live, that we live in many cases, because her pain and her suffering meant the rest of us could avoid polio and the worst of COVID-19, survive cancer, be able to live with HIV, and not be subject to undue amounts of radiation. And that's just for an opening act. Henrietta Lacks' life after life has had a critical part to play in every medical research lab since the day she died at age 31. Because her cells don't die, like ever. Henrietta's biographer, Rebecca Skloot, told the BBC her cells were one of the most important things to happen to medicine.
They were used to help create the polio vaccine. They went up in first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. They were used to create our most important cancer medications like vincristine and tamoxifen. Her cells were the first ever cloned, her genes some of the first ever mapped. They were used to help develop in vitro fertilization. Basically, almost all of the vaccines we take today can be traced back to research with her cells. There isn't a person out there who hasn't benefited from research on her cells.
Henrietta's living cells are in labs that research Parkinson's, sickle cell, measles, mumps, Zika, and Ebola. They have single-handedly created the science of virology, the study of how viruses work and how we might stop them from working quite so well. The cells have been indispensable in the unraveling of the human genome. A lot of that was done anonymously, and probably by design. Crimes come in many forms and in varying degrees. And while there's no crime in this country straight up called racism, it sure does fuel an awful lot of crimes that do carry specific statutes and punishments, and it shows no signs of being eradicated. In a small way, Henrietta Lacks tackled that too and made some bigots blanch. She didn't live to know what she had done, but her family, once they knew and understood, fought for her right to be recognized as the pioneer she was. The crime is that it's taken decades to do that. The crime is that her role in modern medicine was hidden for almost 25 years and tamped down for more. The crime is that medical miracles made because she lived have reaped trillions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies and bioengineering industries and medical laboratories, even while her own children and their children could not afford health care. It appears that because they were poor and black, nobody thought to include them in her largesse. Or, if they did, no one thought they mattered enough to do anything about it. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Storyworth. You know, when you're a kid, you kind of roll your eyes at the "when I was a kid" stories your dad tells. But now that I'm well into adulthood, I'm much more interested in those tales.
Oh, me too. I love learning about family history.
That's why a few years ago, I sent my dad the gift of Storyworth memoirs. I mean, really, it was a gift to me, but he enjoyed it too.
Each week, Storyworth emails your loved one a memory-provoking question that you get to help pick. Questions like, did you ever get in trouble in school? Or how did you decide how many children to have?
That's right. Then your loved one just responds to that email with a story. Long or short, it doesn't matter. They can either write it themselves or record it over the phone for Storyworth to transcribe. Then at the end of the year of questions, Storyworth compiles your loved one's tales and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit.
I've seen your dad's. I've learned a lot about him that way.
I did too, really. There were a lot of these little tidbits about his childhood I didn't know, and it made me appreciate his parents a lot more too. Give the dads in your life a unique, heartfelt gift you'll all cherish for years. Storyworth.
Right now, save $10 during their Father's Day sale when you go to storyworth.com/COTC.
That's storyworth.com/COTC to save $10 on your order. I started this episode by saying that Henrietta Lacks' life looked, from the outside, as particularly hard. But that's short-sighted. It's missing that she had family that loved her. It's also missing that most of that family remembered her as beautiful and happy, smiling almost to the end when the pain was too much to bear. A woman who loved to sing and dance and dress up. It's worth noting that when she died, her toenails were still painted a bright red. She was born Loretta Pleasant in Roanoke, Virginia on the 1st of August, 1920. She was the 9th child of 10. All were crammed into a shack near a railroad track close to the tobacco farm that the family helped to work. It's unclear when Loretta's name morphed into Henrietta, and no one seemed to recall why. Suffice to know that she was called Henny by her siblings for as long as anyone could remember. When Henrietta was just 4, her mother died, giving birth to the last of the 10 children. That brood proved too much for her father, Johnny, who moved them all back to his home place in Clover, Virginia, where his family there still worked the same farm where their not-so-ancient ancestors had been enslaved. The unincorporated community still only boasts 438 residents. In the 1920s, most of those residents were Lacks. The 10 siblings were divvied up among the residents, with Henrietta settling in with her paternal grandfather Tommy in what once had been slave quarters. Think drafty, think simple, think barely shelter from sometimes snowy winters, which can be wet and cold, or from summers, which were sweaty and hot and an open invitation for ticks, mosquitoes, and cockroaches to come calling. It offered no running water. Henrietta shared a small room with her first cousin, David, whom everyone called Day. He was 5 years older than she. According to Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, the two children grew up together, doing chores, working with their farmyard animals, and nurturing the garden where they got most of their food. Tobacco is a crop that is particularly labor-intensive. It requires, even today, to be touched 13 times before harvest. It was a full-time, everyday commitment for the Lacks family, and no one was allowed to loaf. Which isn't to say they didn't have fun. Skloot's interviews with those familiar with the family told how they enjoyed going to the movies, playing games, riding, and racing horses. Henrietta literally walked 2 miles each way to a segregated school, but just after 6th grade, was put to work in the tobacco fields. Day had left school sometime during his 4th grade year. Later, when a medical workup was done on her, it would be noted that she had a deviated septum for most of her life and had suffered with a toothache for 5 years, though she eventually got dental care. When she was just 14, she gave birth to her first child, Lawrence. Day Lacks was the father. At 18, she gave birth to her second child, Elsie. Day Lacks and Henrietta were building a family. The first cousins married in 1941 when she was 20 and he was 25. No one attended the private ceremony held at the preacher's house that made everything nice and legal. Little Elsie was considered a slow child and was later diagnosed as an epileptic. She never learned to speak. Henrietta took her everywhere she went, even when she worked the fields. Near the end of 1941, a cousin named Fred Garrett returned to Clover to talk about his new, prosperous life working in the steel mills of Baltimore. He had no trouble convincing Day that this was the wave of the future, given the war that was brewing overseas. Victoria Baptiste, a descendant, said the urge to leave Virginia was simple.
A lot of the men there didn't have a lot of opportunities for work in the South, so they came to Maryland to work in the steel mills and things of that nature.
Day soon had a ticket to Baltimore and plans to put down roots in Turner Station, the small working enclave outside of Baltimore, a community built to house black steel workers. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and all of America was in the war machine-making business that took steel. That meant change for the Lacks family. When Cousin Fred got drafted, he gave the money he'd been saving to Day so he could bring Henrietta and his 2 children to live with him in Maryland. That money also helped Day and Henrietta buy a house and start their new lives. The war wore on, and things for Day and Henrietta, at least on the surface, were better than they had been in Virginia. Henrietta had family around here, and the steel mill at Sparrows Point, where the men worked, soon became the largest in the world. Henrietta didn't have to work outside the home. She gave birth to David Jr. in 1947 and to Deborah in 1949. It's hard to know how happy the 1940s were for Henrietta. Day was notoriously unfaithful, occasionally bringing home sexually transmitted diseases from his overzealous interaction with sex workers available in both Clover and Turner Station. He was treated for syphilis with the newfound miracle drug penicillin. Shortly after their 4th child, Deborah, was born, 29-year-old Henrietta told her female relatives that she thought she had a knot inside of her. She said it hurt every time she and Day had sex. She told her close female cousin she worried it might have had something to do with their latest child's birth. Something had been torn or ruptured. Her cousins listened, but told her they thought maybe it was just another pregnancy. Henrietta said no, this was different. A week or so passed after that conversation when Henrietta discovered she was, in fact, pregnant. Didn't matter. She still maintained the knot had been there before she would have gotten pregnant. Now, the pregnancy was normal, but Henrietta's ability to care for Elsie, who was becoming unmanageable and dangerous to herself, became impossible. The only solution she and Day could find was to send Elsie to Crownsville State Hospital, 90 minutes away. Henrietta visited weekly. It nearly broke her. But she had her other children and a baby on the way. Despite her continuing health worries and her fresh sadness over Elsie, baby Joseph was born healthy. Less than 5 months later, Henrietta saw some blood on her underwear. It was not time for her menstrual period, and she somehow knew this was the knot making itself known. She disrobed, put herself in a warm bath, and felt up inside her to find what she already knew was there. She found a hard lump, as she had suspected. She asked Day to take her into Baltimore to the renowned Johns Hopkins University Hospital, the only hospital for miles around that took Black patients. It also served as a charity hospital, which meant that care would be given even without the assurance that doctors would be paid. Make no mistake, the facilities were segregated, but she ostensibly got the same care that white women were afforded. She was seen in the clinic by Dr. Howard Jones, the gynecologist on call that day. He wrote in his notes that Henrietta had unexplained vaginal bleeding and, quote, has no liking for sexual intercourse, end quote. He also observed that she had asymptomatic neurosyphilis, but that she had canceled syphilis treatments because she said she felt fine. Dr. Jones also took note that, prior to his visit, quote, a physician recommended diagnostics and a specialist for ruling out infection or cancer. Patient canceled appointment. 1 month prior to the current visit, patient tested positive for gonorrhea. Patient recalled to clinic for treatment. No response. End quote. Denial? Maybe. Embarrassment? Maybe. Too busy? Maybe. Undereducated about the ravages of untreated venereal disease? Most certainly. The doctor's notes also show that he was obviously clinically stumped that she had had a child in this same hospital a few months earlier, and that there had been no abnormality noted on her cervix at that time, nor was anything out of place when she returned 6 weeks later after that for a routine postpartum follow-up. Now there was something. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Cornbread Hemp. I have had a really tough couple of weeks.
Yeah, you have.
I've had an HVAC go out. I had a sewer line back up. I can't get QuickBooks to do what it's supposed to do. So my stress level is up to here. And the only thing helping me wind down at night has been Cornbread Hemp's new THC seltzers. They're so good.
I want them at all the bars because they're the new way to have a great time with friends without the booze or the bad decisions.
I love it so much. This is a low-calorie drink with only 30 calories and 5 grams of sugar. It's made with pure THC and all-natural ingredients, no synthetics.
Each can has 5 milligrams of THC, which is the perfect amount so you don't feel couch-bound or paranoid. And you don't wake up with a hangover, which is clutch.
Right now, Crimes of the Centuries listeners can save 30% off their first order and enjoy free shipping on orders over $75.
Head to cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC at checkout.
That's cornbreadhemp.com/COTC, code COTC, Cornbread Hemp. This is the good life.
So good.
Dr. Howard Jones noted that Henrietta's quote-unquote knot was about the size of a nickel and bled at the slightest touch. He found it to be shiny and purple, like grape jelly, he wrote. It was also without precedent in his long experience as a gynecologist, and he had seen thousands of lesions. If this was what he thought it was, and it had not been in evidence just weeks earlier, this Black housewife had the most aggressive cancer he had ever seen. Appropriately, he cut a small sample of it and sent it to the hospital's lab for diagnostic purposes. In early February, the test results were in, and Dr. Jones called and told Henrietta that it was cancer, malignant and incredibly fast-moving. She told no one, explaining to her husband only that she needed to go back so they could, quote-unquote, fix her up. She went back for treatment and, while unconscious, Dr. Lawrence Wharton Jr. took 2 samples, one from her tumor, the other from the part of her cervix that was still healthy. Author Rebecca Skloot.
Without telling her, before treating her tumor, her doctor just cut a little piece and put it in a dish. And he sent that down the hall to George Guy, who is the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. And George Guy had been trying to grow human cells outside of the body for decades, and it had never worked.
It was routine. The pieces would go to Dr. George Gay's office as part of his so far unsuccessful attempt to find a medium in which cancer cells would grow. The non-cancerous tissues were used as a barometer of normal growth. No one asked if they could take the sample. No one told Henrietta about Dr. Gay. She was not an exception. This is how things were done at the time. Now, Dr. Gay was an inventive guy. He had tried everything he could think of as material in which to make cells grow. Things like chicken plasma, calf fetus puree, salts, umbilical cord blood. Anything. Sometimes the cancerous cells would grow a bit, but then would die within a few days. The whole arena of women's health had taken a giant leap forward just a few years before when doctors George Papanicolaou and Herbert Trout had published a paper on the relatively painless and very high effectiveness of a test for cervical cancer. George and his wife were the collectors of the original samples, hence the name of the test, Pap smear. It would not be until 1960 that the American Cancer Society embraced the Pap smear as a screening tool. Up until then, cervical cancers were usually fairly progressed when they were found and required women to undergo total hysterectomies to prevent their spread. All of that was on the table as Henrietta's doctors pondered what to do next. The most obvious tool was to treat the tumor with radium to shrink it. 1 week after diagnosis, then, Dr. Worden clamped a bit of radium onto Henrietta's cervix and, with tubes running into her body at every possible spot, she waited to see if the radioactive substance would miraculously wipe her cervix clean. Here's one of her descendants, Veronica Robinson, speaking in a World Health Organization documentary.
In our family, we believe that we never told stories on the dead. But imagine having someone you love back then, the practice being that they sold radium to her cervix, burning her from the inside out.
Henrietta went home a few days later to take care of her husband and children and was expected to return to the hospital for more of the same. And this was not a pain-free treatment, to be clear. Her son, Lawrence Lacks.
I know she had a lot of pain, but she tried not to let nobody know, but she tried to stay to herself up in the bedroom, cry and different things like that, so I try to help her out much as possible.
As Henrietta battled that at home, back in Dr. Gay's lab, her cancerous cells began to double, then double again, and again.
And for reasons that remained a mystery, Henrietta's cells just never died, so they started doubling their numbers every 24 hours.
Exponentially, as the days piled up, so did the cells, until there were millions of them. In her book, Skloot wrote, quote, "Soon, George told a few of his closest colleagues that he thought his lab might have grown the first immortal human cells, to which they replied, 'Can I have some?' And George said yes," end quote. The trick, it appeared, was that these cells were not actually attaching to any medium. They were just so aggressive that they had no time to do so, powered by something that, even today, is not well understood. Before they were sent out for other research work, they were labeled, per the protocol, with the first two letters of the patient's first and last names. When the samples began appearing elsewhere, they were simply HeLa cells. After her first radium treatment, Henrietta went back to Johns Hopkins and was told her cervix was, indeed, free of the lesion. Doctors suggested more preventative radiation for her uterus, which Henrietta agreed to. Things were looking up, and it had just been 3 weeks. That's when Gay went on local TV to announce he was growing cancer cells and gloated that this could be the breakthrough we'd all been waiting for in conquering the disease. Nobody paid a lot of attention, generally speaking, but not so generally, health researchers did. And Gay and his cohorts at Hopkins, never charging a dime for the product, began shipping the cells worldwide. And funny thing, those cells behaved just as wildly in New York, Houston, Paris, New Delhi, and Sydney as they did in Baltimore. Their uses, when doled out to multiple researchers for multiple purposes, soon looked endless. They were, for the record, shipped via the U.S. Postal Service. Michael Motley of One Mike Black History.
Despite being cancerous, HeLa cells shared some basic characteristics of normal cells. They produced protein, they communicated with one another like normal cells, they divided, they generated energy, and more importantly, they were susceptible to infections, which made them an optimal tool for synthesizing and studying bacteria, hormones, proteins, and especially viruses.
You could use these rapidly metastasizing cells while never once endangering human lives. You could put them in grinders, throw acid on them, slice and dice any which way, and, if successful, great. If not, there were plenty more cells where that came from. Nobody knew what HeLa stood for. Gay never mentioned her name. Henrietta, of course, knew nothing of any of this. She even thought of getting pregnant again. Apparently, her doctors had failed to inform her that the treatment she'd agreed to made her sterile. If she had known, she later said, she would not have agreed to them. But that revelation came too late, after she had ostensibly been given a clean bill of health. As summer approached, she was sure she was sick again. Doctors repeatedly examined her and told her there was no indication her cancer had returned. Except it had. Sometime in mid-June 1951, Doctors found an inoperable mass on her pelvic wall, blocking her urethra. By August, she was in terrible pain. The tumors had multiplied and were virtually everywhere. There was nothing to be done. A microbiologist who worked with Dr. Gay told author Skloot that Gay said he went to see Henrietta when she became desperately ill, that he told her her cells would save lives. He said Henrietta had smiled. There is, however, no record in her medical file to verify the visit. As the summer wore on, doctors suspended treatment and gave her only palliative care, as much morphine as she could stand. She died a few minutes after midnight on October 4th, 1951. She was just a few months into her 31st year. We don't know for certain that George Gay was informed that very day that Henrietta had died. What we do know is that he chose, on that very day, to have a press conference on the steps of the very hospital she died in to announce that he had definitively cultivated miracle cells that would change the face of medicine. Again, he made no mention of Henrietta. And yet, some of her cells were spread across the globe, put to use daily, hourly even, in the name of science to figure out how to stop the bad stuff. The entire first half of the 20th century was haunted by polio, a virus among the most feared in the world. It often caused death and, as frequently, permanent limb paralysis. Before Henrietta died, 2 researchers had, in 1948, been the first to successfully grow poliovirus in live cells. It's likely that before she died, scientists had already discovered that HeLa cells were highly susceptible to infection by the virus that causes polio. By 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk was using HeLa cells. He had previously been experimenting on expensive and sparse rhesus monkeys who died as a result of the experimentation to test the efficacy of his vaccine for polio, a necessary step before instituting any vaccination protocol for the rest of the world. At that time, at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, yes, where the infamous public health study on the effects of syphilis was exploiting hundreds of black men, see Season 4, Episode 21, a HeLa cell culture production lab was set up to give polio researchers all the HeLa they could put their hands on. Named the George Washington Carver Research Foundation, the idea was to provide funding, training, and jobs for aspiring black scientists. Thus, they created the first nonprofit to culture and distribute the cells. The 6-person team grew to become a team of 35. When they were up and running, they sent out 6 trillion cells each week. The polio vaccine then could be tested in an ever-widening population and was proven to be an exceptionally safe and effective shield against contracting the disease. That idea and template would, within a few years, be copied by microbiological associates in Bethesda, Maryland. They would begin mass-producing the HeLa cells for profit, which have sold for as little as $10 a vial to as much as $10,000 per vial. No one asked the Lacks if they would like a piece of that action. And that is, in part, because nobody had done much to identify where these ubiquitous wonder cells had come from. They didn't try. But the family, 2 decades after their beloved grandmother had died, was finally let in on the secret. Victoria Baptiste, speaking for the family.
It was actually quite by accident that the family initially learned about the cells being used at Hopkins. My grandfather's wife, Babette Lacks, was actually at dinner at a friend's house. And, when their introductions were being made, and they introduced her as Babette Lacks, the gentleman that was there said, Lacks isn't a familiar name. That's not common. Do you know a Henrietta Lacks? And she was like, that was my mother-in-law.
And whoever he was explained what he knew. Henrietta's children, her grandchildren, nieces, and nephews were all staggered by the news. Granddaughter Jerry Lacks told the BBC,
"This information was out there for so many years, and the family was not even aware of Henrietta's, that they had taken cells from Henrietta Lacks, and these cells have been used all over the world by scientists, labs, researchers, and millions of dollars have been made, and you still have the family struggling with basic health care."
Like she said, the story had more or less been out there in the scientific community for a bit, but it wasn't until journalist Michael Rogers wrote a piece in Rolling Stone magazine in March of 1976 that the link between Henrietta and the HeLa cells was made explicit to the world. Magazines that traditionally catered to a Black audience, Jet and Ebony, covered the story in quick succession. 9 years later came the first book on the magic cells, A Conspiracy of Cells, One Woman's Immortal Legacy, and the Medical Scandal It Created by Michael Gold. That was followed by Skloot's work that, at last, detailed what Henrietta had lived through and what her family had not been made aware of. Oprah Winfrey followed that with a 2017 movie based on the story.
For years, it seemed like a dream. About our mother, could this be true?
The movie, like Skloot's book, focused on the injustice that had been done the Lacks all while everyone else prospered. Because, make no mistake, the value of the cell line that sprang from Henrietta's knot was of incalculable worth. Did someone get away with the greatest theft of the century? If so, who? George Gay had never sold a single vial. He had given it away. Did those who would eventually sell the products they made by using the HeLa even consider where the cells had originated? Did they mean to steal them? Was it, in fact, stealing at all? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have good answers. In a piece entitled Consent Conundrum in Slate magazine in 2010, writer Jeremy Singer-Vine wrote, quote, "At the time, researchers considered consent-free donations and experimentation a fair trade for the free healthcare in the public wards. They said requiring consent encumbered scientific progress through bureaucracy and feared the patients would decline en masse." End quote. The result? It's better not to give patients a choice rather than constantly scrambling to get permission. Singer-Vine noted in his essay that Henrietta might have declined if she'd been asked, because the Black community she lived in had so little trust in the white doctors at Johns Hopkins at the time.
To get new samples after her death would require the permission of her family. See, the law was very clear about performing an autopsy or removing tissue from the dead without permission was extremely illegal, but there was no such provision requiring doctors to do the same for living patients.
In Henrietta's case, then, no permission was needed when she was alive, but was after she died. Johns Hopkins medical personnel complied with that requirement and asked Day's permission to autopsy her. He at first said no. Then, after returning to the hospital a few days later, was approached again. Told that allowing the autopsy might help his children someday, he agreed that the postmortem could go forward. He would later tell Skloot that the doctors never said anything about keeping her alive in test tubes or growing her cells for experimentation or study. So what about the record keeping? Deep inside Johns Hopkins, Henrietta's name was on those cells, though strangely enough, the HeLa cells were variously attributed, in various places, to Helen Lane, then to a Henry Lawson. Misunderstanding? Maybe. But there was some reasonable belief that Henrietta's name was purposely obscured, not to screw the family, but because of the fear of pushback. Henrietta's grandson, Alfred Lacks, explains.
They didn't want people to know that the HeLa cell came from a Black woman born in Virginia that migrated to Maryland, because they thought that if people knew that this cell came from a Black woman, they would be reluctant to get the polio vaccine and everything else that people needed to exist in those times.
Now, I get pushback from some listeners of the show when I point out when things are racist, but we're living in a world where doctors in the not very distant past worried that people would refuse life-saving treatment because that treatment had been touched by a Black woman's cells. So, yeah, that's racist. But back to Henrietta. Remember, she had been very much alive when her cells had been taken and been found to be extraordinary in the extreme. Shouldn't someone have said something then? I mean, even if they hadn't known when they procured the first sample what the value of her cells would be, once they figured it out, which, again, was while she was alive, shouldn't they have given her some kind of backdated informed consent so that she could decide how to proceed? Maybe they figured by then she was already too sick to appreciate the ramifications, or maybe the educated doctors and nurses felt she was too uneducated to understand, or, more likely, maybe they weren't inclined to do something now that they had never done before. Though informed consent was not a new concept, the notion of giving no deadly medicine without the patient's knowledge dates, in fact, to the Hippocratic Oath. That'd be circa 5th century BCE, and was more or less considered a good idea, but not, a legal matter for the courts. Until some serious legal challenges arose in the early 20th century and, as a result, helped to codify the American medical community's principles as to treatment. After World War II, the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials established the Nuremberg Code, which still governs experimentation on human subjects. The fallout from the Tuskegee syphilis study then gave rise to new and stricter consent requirements in 1979. That was followed in 1996 by the passage of the Health Insurance Portability and Accounting Act, you know it better as HIPAA, which mandates that patients be fully informed about risks and benefits of and any alternatives for the medical procedures or research study their doctors are suggesting. So, yeah, as medicine gets more complicated, the ethics of consent do too. At the forefront of the fight, from 1976 on, the Lacks family has been demonstrably visible and vocal about patient rights and researcher responsibility. Because they figured the HeLa cells were Henrietta's first. She made them. And that should count for something. The Lacks family is not the only family to have a member whose tissue has been harvested and used without their knowledge. Not by a long, long shot. The Rand Corporation did an end-of-the-century accounting of tissue sample use in the United States. In 1999, they issued a report that conservatively estimated more than 307 million tissue samples from more than 178 million people were currently stored. The report also noted that the majority of those samples had been taken without permission. In 1990, John Moore, a worker on the Alaska pipeline, had been undergoing treatment for hairy cell leukemia at the University of California, Los Angeles for more than a decade. His cell line had, without his knowledge or consent, been found to be unkillable as well, and had been commercialized by his doctor, who had patented the cell line. That year, he sued the doctor and the university, and in a lengthy process, the matter ended up in front of the California Supreme Court. It ultimately ruled against Moore in a 4-3 ruling, saying that discarded tissue samples no longer belong to the patient, and thus, the patient has no right to the profits generated by them. As a small aside, those profits were estimated at $3 billion. Now, in reality, I don't see much difference between Moore's case and Lacks. In both situations, cells were used in ways they didn't consent to. The only real difference in the cases appears to be that Moore figured out what was happening while he was still alive, and he had the means and opportunity to sue, whereas Lacks did not. Also, her family was misled about her cell's value long after she died. Moore knew, sued over it, and thanks to the court ruling against him, set legal precedent that most courts in the U.S. have usually followed, but not always. In 2005, the Native American Havasupai tribe sued Arizona State University for making use of samples they had given for other purposes than the stated one, which was to study diabetes. Without tribe members' consent, the samples were used by ASU to study schizophrenia, inbreeding, and evolutionary genetics. 5 years later, the school settled out of court for a lump sum payment of $700,000. ASU also had to return the samples to the tribe and offer financial assistance to set up a health clinic for the chronically poor community. Then there was the case of the National Institute of Health scientist who was charged in 2006 with providing 3,200 samples of cerebrospinal fluid and plasma to the pharmaceutical developer Pfizer in exchange for $300,000 and with profiting from lectures arranged by Pfizer, which netted an additional $300,000. According to the National Library of Medicine and the Los Angeles Times, the researcher was charged, oddly enough, with a conflict of interest. That is, for not disclosing his work with Pfizer to his superiors, the U.S. government. Alarmed, Congress convened a committee at the time and found that NIH had, quote, no uniform, centralized, and mandatory authority regulating the handling of human tissue samples, end quote. In the 1990s, medical breakthroughs clarified that Henrietta's cancer was caused by the human papillomavirus. That discovery helped scientists link the disease to cervical cancer and, ultimately, to the creation of the HPV vaccine, which, as of 2022, only about 40% of American children ages 9 to 17 have received. Only 16% of American adults ages 25 to 45 have likewise been immunized. It's available to boys as well as girls, men as well as women. In 2010, the Commonwealth of Virginia erected a historical marker in Clover, Virginia, marking the place where Henrietta grew up. She's buried nearby. In 2023, biochemical giant Thermo Fisher settled with the Lacks family for an undisclosed sum after the family accused the company of profiting from the HeLa cells without authority or permission to do so. In the lawsuit, their lawyer charged that Thermo Fisher's actions were the result of a, quote, racially unjust medical system. From NBC News.
Finally, after more than 70 years, a measure of justice for the family of Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without her family's consent and led to groundbreaking medical discoveries.
Her family sued multi-billion-dollar Thermo Fisher Scientific in 2021, saying the company, quote, made staggering profits by using the HeLa cell line, although it, quote, has known that HeLa cells were stolen from Ms. Lacks.
The settlement was finalized on what would have been Henrietta's 103rd birthday. HeLa cells have been used in more than 60,000 significant medical research studies and are still being used today. 3 of those studies made such important discoveries that they were awarded Nobel Prizes in chemistry as well as in physiology and medicine to 9 separate researchers in 2008, 2009, and 2014. HeLa cells were the first cell line to be found to be able to replicate indefinitely, but they are not the only cells that now are known to be, quote-unquote, immortal. Embryonic stem cells have been found to have this ability, as do a few other cell lines. In some cases, new bioengineering has tinkered with some cells so that they, too, live on. HeLa cells, though, are still the gold standard as they are easy to manipulate, are available in abundance, and travel well. The ethics of their use, though, are almost as murky today as they were in 1951. The Lacks family fought hard and now have a place on committees that review applications that plan to use the HeLa genome for medical research. They still have no control over how the HeLa cells are used otherwise, nor are they compensated for their continued use. In 2010, this happened.
Johns Hopkins Medical Center sincerely acknowledges the contribution to the advances in biomedical researches made by Henrietta and her HeLa cells. It is important to note that at the time the cells were taken from Ms. Lacks, that the practice of obtaining informed consent from cell or tissue donors was essentially unknown among academic medical centers. Johns Hopkins never patented HeLa cells, nor did they sell them, commercially benefit them in any direct way. Today, Johns Hopkins and other research-based medical centers consistently obtain consent from those asked to donate tissues or cells for medical research.
That last bit is not a universal mandate or practice. Research using tissues that had been extracted for, say, diagnostic purposes, many of those with consent attached, and using that tissue for other additional reasons is still badly regulated. There are still no hard and fast rules about who owns the cells once they've been taken from the living. This is lawyer and Dr. Tyler S. Gibb, a co-chair of the Western Michigan University School of Medicine's program in medical ethics, humanities, and law.
If Henrietta Lacks were a patient today, biospecimens would be collected for her clinical care that would require her consent. Obviously, she would have to be involved in that process. But it's not clear and it's not consistent that she would be asked to provide consent for future research, for ongoing research.
That said, the Lacks family has made the medical establishment say her name and recognize that a Black, undereducated woman of strength and character, however unwittingly, changed the world. Reaching, you say? And probably not. Experts on the subject say there is likely no American alive today who hasn't benefited from the fact that while she got cancer and died, her cells never got the memo. They extend that to say that a lot of the rest of the world has similarly been healthier for her pain, and that those cells are not even remotely finished with us. They might never be. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and Michael Rogers' Rolling Stone magazine piece, The Double-Edged Helix. She read various online essays on the medical implications and ethical challenges presented by Mrs. Lacks' cell line. The World Health Organization documentary that spoke to her living relatives was especially helpful. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.